It's the year 53 before Christ, and one of the most powerful men in the ancient world is about to make a decision that will echo through history. Marcus Licinius Crassus stands at the edge of the Roman Empire, staring into the vast Mesopotamian desert. He's not just rich. He's so wealthy that his name has become synonymous with fortune itself. But here's the thing about having everything. Sometimes it makes you hungry for the one thing you don't have. Crassus had money, influence, and political power as part of Rome's first triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey. But while Caesar was conquering Gaul and building his legend as a military genius, and Pompey was basking in his eastern victories, Crassus felt like the third wheel at history's most exclusive party. He had the gold, but he lacked the glory, and that gnawing feeling was about to drive him toward one of the most catastrophic military disasters in Roman history. You see, Crassus wasn't content being remembered as just another rich politician. He wanted to be a conqueror, a hero whose name would be spoken in the same breath as Alexander the Great. The Parthian Empire, Rome's eastern rival, seemed like the perfect target. After all, hadn't Rome conquered everyone else? What could possibly go wrong? But here's where the story gets fascinating and tragic. Success had made Crassus blind to his own limitations. He'd never really commanded a major military campaign, yet he was convinced that Roman superiority and his own wealth could overcome any obstacle. It's like watching someone who's never driven a car decide to enter a Formula One race because they own the fanciest sports car in town. The irony is almost painful when you think about it. Crassus had built his fortune through some pretty questionable business practices. He'd buy burning buildings at rock-bottom prices, then send his private fire brigade to put out the flames. He turned other people's disasters into his own profit. Now, driven by ambition, he was about to walk straight into his own inferno, one that no amount of gold could extinguish. What makes this story so compelling isn't just the scale of what's about to happen, but the very human emotions driving it. We've all felt that sting of inadequacy, that desire to prove ourselves worthy of respect. But when you're one of the most powerful men in the ancient world, those feelings can have consequences that reshape empires. This is the story of how greed, ambition, and wounded pride led to one of history's most shocking military disasters, a battle that would end the first triumvirate, spark a civil war, and ultimately contribute to the fall of the Roman Republic itself. Sometimes the biggest disasters begin with the smallest wounds to our ego. To understand why Crassus made such a fatal decision, we need to step back and look at the political landscape of Rome in the 1st century before Christ. Picture the most exclusive club in the ancient world. That's what the first triumvirate was. 3 men, arguably the most powerful in the Roman Republic, had secretly agreed to divide the world between them. There was Julius Caesar, the brilliant politician and military strategist who was busy conquering Gaul and building a reputation that would last millennia. Then you had Pompey the Great, whose very nickname tells you everything about his status. He'd already earned his glory through spectacular victories in the East. And finally, there was Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose claim to fame was being so ridiculously wealthy that his fortune dwarfed entire kingdoms. Now here's where it gets interesting. On paper, this should have been a perfect partnership. Caesar brought political cunning and military genius, Pompey contributed proven battlefield success and veteran loyalty, and Crassus? Well, Crassus brought the money. Lots and lots of money. In fact, historians estimate his wealth was equivalent to the entire annual revenue of the Roman treasury. Imagine being so rich that you could personally fund the entire government for a year. But money, as Crassus was learning, couldn't buy you everything. While his 2 partners were out there making history and earning the kind of respect that comes from leading men into battle, Crassus was stuck in Rome, playing the role of financier. He could see the way people looked at Caesar and Pompey, with genuine admiration, even awe. When they looked at him, he saw something different. Respect, yes, but the kind you show to a banker, not a hero. The psychological torture of this situation is almost unbearable to imagine. Here's a man who literally has everything money can buy, yet he's consumed by envy. for something that seems impossible to purchase: military glory. Every dispatch from Gaul brought news of Caesar's latest triumph. Every report from the east highlighted another of Pompey's achievements. And Crassus? He was getting richer, but he wasn't getting the one thing he truly craved. What makes this even more fascinating is how Crassus had built his fortune in the first place. He'd essentially turned tragedy into profit through one of history's most controversial business models. When buildings caught fire in Rome, which happened frequently in a city built largely of wood, Crassus would rush to the scene with his private fire brigade. But here's the twist. He wouldn't put out the fire until the desperate owner agreed to sell him the property at a fraction of its value. Only then would his men spring into action to save what was left. It was brilliant, ruthless, and incredibly effective. Crassus understood that people in crisis would pay anything or sell anything to escape disaster. He built an empire by profiting from other people's emergencies. The irony is almost poetic. A man who made his fortune from fires was now burning with an ambition that would ultimately consume him. This wasn't just about ego, though ego certainly played a part. In Roman society, military success was the ultimate mark of a man's worth. Political achievements were respected. Wealth was envied. But military glory? That was immortality. That was how you earned your place in history alongside the great heroes of the past. So there sat Crassus, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, yet feeling like the poorest man in Rome. He had the gold, but his partners had the glory. And in a culture that worshipped military achievement above all else, that made him feel like a failure despite his success. The stage was set for disaster, and Crassus was about to walk straight into it, driven by the very human need to prove that he was more than just Rome's richest accountant. Now comes the moment when Crassus had to make a choice that would seal his fate, and he made exactly the wrong one. Standing at the crossroads between two possible invasion routes, he faced what seemed like a simple strategic decision. But sometimes the most innocent-looking choices carry the weight of history. King Artavasdes II of Armenia had offered Crassus a lifeline wrapped in good sense. "Come through my territory," the Armenian king suggested. "My mountain passes will protect your flanks, my people know the terrain, and we can coordinate our forces against the Parthians." It was the kind of offer that any experienced military commander would jump at. Local knowledge, allied support, and defensible terrain. But Crassus wasn't thinking like an experienced military commander. He was thinking like a man desperate to prove himself, and that desperation made him suspicious of help. Accepting Armenian assistance would mean sharing the glory of victory. It would mean admitting he needed support to achieve what Caesar and Pompey had accomplished on their own. His pride simply couldn't stomach it. Instead, Crassus chose the direct route, straight across the Mesopotamian desert toward Parthian territory. On the surface, it seemed bold, decisive, even brilliant. Why waste time with political negotiations and complicated alliances when you could march your legions directly to victory? After all, these were Roman soldiers, the finest fighting force the world had ever seen. What could possibly stop them? What Crassus didn't realize was that he'd just walked into the oldest trap in military history. He'd chosen speed over safety, pride over prudence. And in doing so, he'd given his enemies exactly what they wanted: Roman legions isolated in hostile territory with nowhere to run. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The guide who led Crassus into the desert wasn't just any local hired hand. His name was Ariamnes, and he came recommended by Abgarus, a supposed ally of Rome. What Crassus didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that both men were playing a double game. They were Parthian agents, carefully planted to lead his army exactly where the enemy wanted them to go. Imagine the bitter irony of this situation. Crassus, the man who'd built his fortune by exploiting people in desperate situations, was now being expertly manipulated by someone playing the exact same game. The hunter had become the hunted, and he didn't even know it. Day after day, Ariamnes led the Roman army deeper into the wasteland. "Just a little further," he'd say. "The enemy is retreating. They're afraid to face your mighty legions." And Crassus, hungry for the easy victory he'd been promised, believed every word. It's painful to think about. 40,000 Roman soldiers following a guide who was leading them to their doom, while their commander congratulated himself on his strategic brilliance. The desert itself became an enemy more ruthless than any human opponent. The Mesopotamian heat is crushing even today, but imagine marching through it in full armor, carrying heavy equipment, with limited water supplies. The sun beats down mercilessly, the sand gets into everything, and the horizon shimmers with mirages that promise relief, but deliver only more suffering. Roman legions were designed for European warfare, disciplined formations fighting in temperate climates with reliable supply lines. They were heavy infantry, built for the kind of close-quarters combat that had conquered the Mediterranean world. But here in the open desert, all their advantages turned into liabilities. Their armor became ovens, their tight formations became targets, and their methodical approach became a death march. The landscape itself was working against them. No hills to provide cover, no forests to break up cavalry charges, no rivers to anchor their flanks. Just endless flat terrain that gave mounted archers every possible advantage. It was like forcing a heavyweight boxer to fight while standing waist-deep in quicksand. Every step took them further from safety and closer to destruction. Every mile they marched made retreat more difficult and survival less likely. And through it all, their treacherous guide kept assuring them that victory was just ahead, that the Parthians were weak and frightened, that glory was within their grasp. Crassus had wanted to prove he could win a campaign as brilliant as Caesar's conquest of Gaul or Pompey's eastern victories. Instead, he was about to demonstrate exactly how even the mightiest army could be destroyed by bad decisions, worse intelligence, and the unforgiving mathematics of desert warfare. The trap was closing, and there was no way out. While Crassus was stumbling through the desert, driven by pride and guided by deception, his enemy was preparing a masterclass in military strategy. Meet Surena, a name that should be remembered alongside history's greatest generals, yet somehow remains lost in the shadows of time. Here's what makes this story even more incredible. Surena was only 30 years old, while Crassus, in his 60s, was desperately trying to prove his military worth. This young Parthian commander was about to rewrite the rules of ancient warfare. Sometimes experience isn't everything. Sometimes genius is just genius, regardless of age. Surena understood something that the Romans didn't. You don't have to be stronger to win. You just have to be smarter. His army was smaller than the Roman force, but he'd designed it like a perfectly balanced weapon. Where the Romans brought brute strength, he brought speed and precision. Where they relied on discipline and formation, he embraced mobility and chaos. The heart of his strategy was the mounted archer, warriors who could shoot with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. These weren't just soldiers on horses. They were artists of war who'd spent their entire lives perfecting the most difficult military skill imaginable, hitting a target while both you and your target are moving at high speed. But here's the revolutionary part. They didn't need to stick around for a traditional fight. They could attack, unleash a storm of arrows, and then wheel away before the Romans could respond. It was like trying to fight smoke. Just when you thought you had them, they'd vanish, only to reappear somewhere else entirely. The Romans had a name for this tactic that would become legendary, the Parthian shot. Picture a mounted archer seeming to retreat, luring his enemies forward, then suddenly turning in his saddle to loose an arrow with perfect accuracy. It was psychological warfare as much as physical combat, because it meant safety was always an illusion. Even when the enemy appeared to be running away, death could still find you. Supporting these mobile archers were the cataphracts, the ancient world's equivalent of tanks. These were heavily armored cavalry, both horse and rider covered in scales of metal that could turn aside sword blows and arrow strikes. When the moment was right, when the Roman lines had been softened by arrow fire and disrupted by constant harassment, the cataphracts would thunder forward like an avalanche of steel. Imagine being a Roman legionnaire in that desert, watching this terrifying ballet of death unfold around you. Your commanders keep shouting orders to maintain formation, to advance in disciplined ranks. But how do you advance against an enemy that won't stand still? How do you fight someone who treats the entire battlefield like a giant game board, moving pieces with deadly precision while you're stuck playing by the old rules? Surena had created something that had never been seen before, a combined arms force that could function like a single deadly organism. The mounted archers would sting and harass, drawing the Romans out of position, while the cataphracts waited for the perfect moment to deliver the killing blow. It was coordination on a level that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. What makes this even more remarkable is that Surena was facing the most professional military force in the ancient world. These weren't barbarian raiders or city militias. These were Roman legions, the same troops that had conquered Gaul, Spain, and the Mediterranean. They'd never lost a major battle to an enemy they outnumbered. Until now. The numbers tell the story in stark, brutal terms. When the dust settled after the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthians had lost around 100 men. The Romans, more than 20,000 dead, with another 10,000 captured and enslaved. It wasn't just a defeat, it was mathematical annihilation. Think about those numbers for a moment. In a single day, a 30-year-old general had destroyed one of Rome's greatest armies while barely scratching his own forces. It's the kind of tactical achievement that military historians study centuries later, trying to understand how it was even possible. But here's perhaps the most fascinating detail of all. After achieving this incredible victory, Surena's own success became his downfall. The Parthian king, jealous of his general's growing fame and worried about his ambitions, had him executed within a year of the battle. The man who had humiliated Rome and changed the course of history was killed by his own side, a victim of the same kind of political jealousy that had driven Crassus to his doom. It's a reminder that in the ancient world, being too successful could be just as dangerous as failing. Surena had proven that Roman invincibility was a myth, but in doing so, he'd made himself too powerful to live. Sometimes genius burns too bright for its own good. And speaking of burning bright, did you know that Crassus's head ended up being used as a prop in a theatrical performance at the Parthian court? If you're enjoying this tale of ambition, strategy, and ironic justice, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and drop a comment. What do you think was Crassus's biggest mistake? His greed or his arrogance? After the devastating defeat at Carrhae, with his army shattered and his dreams of glory turned to ash, Crassus found himself in the most desperate situation of his life. The man who had once commanded the respect of Rome through his immense wealth was now trapped in hostile territory, surrounded by enemies who had just proven that Roman invincibility was nothing more than a dangerous myth. What happened next reveals both the cruel irony of fate and the bitter price of unchecked ambition. The Parthians, perhaps recognizing that they held one of Rome's most powerful men, sent word that they were willing to negotiate. Maybe there could be terms for surrender, they suggested. Maybe this disaster could end without complete annihilation. For Crassus, clinging to any hope of survival, these negotiations seemed like a lifeline. Here was a chance to salvage something from the wreckage of his campaign, perhaps even to save the lives of his remaining soldiers. It's heartbreaking to imagine what must have been going through his mind. The man who had dreamed of triumph was now begging for mercy from the very people he'd come to conquer. But the Parthians had no intention of showing mercy. They were playing one final cruel game with the Roman general who had dared to invade their lands. As Crassus approached under the white flag of negotiation, hoping against hope for some kind of honorable resolution, the talks quickly turned violent. The details are murky, but what's clear is that these weren't real negotiations. They were a trap designed to capture Rome's wealthiest citizen. What the Parthians did next has become one of history's most symbolically perfect executions. They had captured a man whose entire identity was built around his incredible wealth, a person who had spent his life accumulating gold and using money as the ultimate measure of power and success. So they decided to give him exactly what he'd always craved, more gold than he could handle. The Parthians melted down precious metal and poured the molten gold down Crassus's throat, reportedly saying, "Satisfy yourself with the riches you have craved." It was execution as performance art, a death that perfectly captured the irony of his life. The man who had built an empire through his hunger for wealth was literally fed gold until it killed him. The symbolism is almost too perfect to be real, yet multiple ancient sources record this detail. Whether it actually happened exactly this way or became embellished over time, the story captured something essential about Crassus's fate, that his greatest strength had become his ultimate weakness, that the very thing he'd pursued most relentlessly had destroyed him in the end. But Crassus's death was more than just personal tragedy or poetic justice. It was a political earthquake that would reshape the entire Roman world. Remember, he wasn't just any wealthy Roman, he was one-third of the First Triumvirate, the secret alliance that had effectively controlled the Republic for years. With Crassus gone, the delicate balance that had kept Caesar and Pompey working together suddenly collapsed. He'd been more than just their financier. He'd been the mediator, the neutral party who could broker agreements between two increasingly ambitious rivals. Without him, there was nothing to prevent their mutual suspicion from erupting into open conflict. The civil war that followed was exactly what the triumvirate had been designed to prevent. Caesar and Pompey, once allies united by mutual benefit, and Crassus's gold, became bitter enemies fighting for sole control of Rome. The Republic, already weakened by decades of political maneuvering and secret deals, couldn't survive the strain of these two titans battling for supremacy. In a very real sense, Crassus's death in the Mesopotamian desert marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic. His quest for personal glory had removed the one person who might have kept Caesar and Pompey from destroying each other, and in the process, destroying the very system they claimed to serve. It's one of history's most tragic examples of unintended consequences. Crassus had marched east seeking military fame to match his financial success. Instead, his failure created a power vacuum that would ultimately lead to the rise of the Roman Empire under Augustus. The republic he'd lived to serve and profit from would die largely because of the ambitions that drove him to his own death. The man who'd spent his life turning other people's disasters into his own profit had finally created a disaster so complete that it consumed not just himself, but the entire political system he'd helped maintain. Sometimes the price of ambition isn't just personal. Sometimes it's the fate of civilizations. In the end, Crassus got his place in history, but not the way he'd hoped. He's remembered not as a great conqueror like Alexander or Caesar, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting pride and greed override wisdom and caution. His golden death became the perfect metaphor for a life spent chasing wealth and glory at any cost. The Battle of Carrhae wasn't just another military defeat in Rome's long history of conquest. It was something far more profound, a harsh lesson about what happens when ambition loses its way, when the pursuit of glory becomes more important than wisdom, and when even the mightiest empire forgets that power without purpose is just destruction waiting to happen. As Crassus's blood mixed with the desert sand and molten gold cooled in his throat, Rome learned something that would echo through the centuries. No empire, no matter how powerful, is truly invincible when greed guides its choices. The very qualities that had made Rome great, discipline, strategy, and calculated aggression, meant nothing when they were driven by the wrong motivations. Think about the bitter irony of it all. Crassus had everything any person could reasonably want. He had wealth beyond imagination, political influence that shaped the known world, and a position at the very heart of Roman power. But it wasn't enough. It's never enough when you're measuring yourself against others instead of asking what you actually need to be happy. The tragedy isn't just that Crassus died in the desert, or even that 20,000 Roman soldiers paid the price for his ambition. The real tragedy is how predictable it all was. Every step of his journey toward disaster was marked by choices that put personal glory above common sense, pride above prudence, and appearance above reality. He rejected Armenian help because accepting it would mean sharing credit. He trusted a guide he barely knew because the man told him what he wanted to hear. He marched into terrain that favored his enemies because taking the safe route seemed less heroic. Each decision seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of self-destruction that was almost mathematically certain to end in catastrophe. What makes this story timeless is how familiar those patterns feel, even today. How many modern leaders have we watched make similar choices, driven by the same toxic combination of ego and ambition? How many businesses, governments, and institutions have collapsed because someone at the top prioritized looking successful over actually being successful? The parallels are everywhere if you know how to look for them. The executive who expands too fast to impress investors, ignoring the fundamentals that built their company. The politician who starts an unnecessary conflict to appear strong, not considering the real costs. The celebrity who destroys their reputation chasing ever greater fame. Different eras, same story. Crassus's ghost walks through our headlines every day, wearing different faces but driven by the same fundamental flaw, the belief that having more money, more power, more recognition, will somehow fill the empty spaces in our souls. But those spaces can't be filled from the outside. They can only be understood and accepted from within. The most haunting aspect of the Carrhae disaster is how it destroyed not just Crassus, but the entire system he was part of. His death unbalanced the triumvirate, leading directly to the civil war between Caesar and Pompey that would tear the Republic apart. One man's personal ambitions ended up reshaping the entire Western world. It's a reminder that our choices don't exist in isolation. The higher we climb in life, the more our personal failures affect other people. Crassus thought he was only risking his own reputation and fortune, but his miscalculations ended up costing thousands of lives and contributing to the fall of a political system that had lasted for centuries. Yet there's something almost beautiful about how history remembers him, not as the conqueror he dreamed of becoming, but as a perfect cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. His story has taught more people about wisdom and humility than any victory could have. In failing so completely, he succeeded in becoming immortal, just not in the way he intended. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes, and the rhymes of Carrhae are everywhere if you listen carefully. Every generation produces its own Crassuses, people who have achieved remarkable success in one area of life but remain tormented by what they lack in others. Today we might call it imposter syndrome or the comparison trap, but the underlying psychology is exactly the same. Social media has made it worse, of course. Now we can compare ourselves not just to our immediate circle, but to everyone on the planet, creating an endless cycle of inadequacy that no amount of achievement can satisfy. The question we should all ask ourselves is this: when we're chasing our own version of military glory, are we doing it for the right reasons? Are we trying to prove something to ourselves or to others? Are we building something meaningful or just feeding our ego? The difference matters more than we might think. Crassus's story reminds us that true strength comes from knowing when you have enough, when you've achieved what matters, and when the costs of wanting more outweigh any possible benefits. It's about recognizing that some victories aren't worth winning, and some battles aren't worth fighting. The desert of Mesopotamia still exists, by the way. The place where 20,000 Romans died is now part of modern Turkey, and if you visit, you can still feel the emptiness that swallowed Crassus's dreams. It's a stark landscape that puts human ambition in perspective, all our grand plans and desperate needs reduced to sand and silence. But from that silence comes wisdom, if we're willing to listen. The lesson of Carrhae isn't that ambition is bad or that we shouldn't strive for greatness. It's that we need to know why we're striving, what price we're willing to pay, and when enough is enough. In the end, Crassus got his immortality, his place in the history books alongside Caesar and Pompey. But while they're remembered for what they built, he's remembered for what he destroyed, including himself. Sometimes the most powerful lesson is learning what not to do, and no one in history has taught that lesson more clearly than the richest man in Rome who died choking on gold in a foreign desert. The echoes of his choices are still reverberating today, 2,000 years later, in every boardroom where greed trumps good sense, In every political decision driven more by ego than wisdom, and in every human heart that mistakes having more for being more. The question is, are we listening? If you've enjoyed this epic journey through one of history's most cautionary tales, hit that like button to help others discover these timeless lessons. Share this story with friends who love history or anyone who could use a reminder about the real cost of unchecked ambition. And don't forget to subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more stories that shaped our world, because understanding the past is the best way to navigate the future. Until our next historical adventure, remember, the greatest victories are often the battles we choose not to fight.